Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. I have always admired reporter Dick Rossee. You may have heard him decades ago on the Mutual Broadcasting System. He was in Berlin when the wall went up and went back to see it come down. He's quite a guy. He speaks to us remotely from his home on the West Coast. I wanted to know, first of all, why Dick got interested in journalism.
Well, Dennis, not to bore the listeners excessively, I knew I wanted to be in radio very early on when I was in grammar school. That was in Buffalo, New York. And I had a favorite radio station in Buffalo, WBEN. And my big dream was to get a job at the big time. And the big time to me was Buffalo. I used to go on Saturday mornings and sit there in the, not in the announce booth, but on the engineer side, on the other side of the glass, and watch people do what I really always wanted to do. I read the radio page. In those days, before television, of course, there were no television listings, but there were radio listings, and there was a lot of information about radio, because that was the primary form of entertainment. But as it happens, by the time I got around to getting into radio, it was 1953, and that was really the tail end of radio as we knew it, the golden days, the Fibber McGee and Mollies, the Bickersons, all the great shows from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They were all either going over to television or just dying. So it was an unusual time and a rather difficult time to break into a medium whose future seemed to be most uncertain, as it turned out to be very uncertain. It's even more uncertain today. But
I was going to say, this is, of all times, this is not the time for a young person, unless they're going to go into a specialty thing such as business reporting, to even think about radio. I mean, there are schools now that sadly are beginning to shut down their radio departments.
Yeah. But you know, a strange thing, Dennis, I read recently that journalism schools are prospering. They're going like gangbusters. And the tuition at these schools, of course, is very high. But journalism itself as an industry, as a profession, seems to be doing okay, at least in the collegiate level. Now, what accounts for it, I really don't know. Back in the 70s, I can tell you why all of a sudden there was a big spike in admissions to journalism school, and that was the release of the movie...
All the President's Men?
Exactly, right. Thank you.
Yes.
And everybody wanted to be Carl Bernstein or Bob Woodward.
You know, there was a wonderful movie, and I hope you might have seen it. It's from the 50s. It got absolutely lost. I think 11 people went to see it. It was Humphrey Bogart and Ethel Barrymore, and it was called Dateline USA.
I was the 12th person.
It was about a big daily newspaper where the employees find out by reading the teletype that they're going out of business in 3 days. And they decide to have every division of the newspaper concentrate on one story, and that's trying to find the goods on a mafia guy named Tomas Rienzi, who is played by, of all people, Martin Gable, who was Arlene Francis's husband.
Exactly.
But that was filmed at the New York Times, and as authentic as you can get. But you're absolutely right. That was an excellent movie, All the President's Men, and I think that the whole Watergate story is so unbelievably complicated that if somebody were to write it today, they would say, this could never happen.
Well, they certainly couldn't make a movie out of it.
No.
And maybe it's just as well they didn't know who Deep Throat was when they did write the script for the film, because that obviously would have complicated matters even more. But if I may continue on this thread of really enjoying the whole business of radio. When I became a bureau chief for a mutual in New York, I spent a dozen years doing that. I had a visitor one day, and she was just out of the University of Maryland, where she was a journalism major, and very charming young lady. And she said she wanted very much to get into radio on the network side. Of course, she had never had a job. And but she was very personable, and you have to take this the right way, Dennis. I invited her across the street to our watering hole, the Stockholm restaurant, And we had a lunch, and I sent her on her way with some valuable words of advice. Get a job in a small station and work your way up. And she thanked me very much. I shook her hand, went back to my job, forgot about her pretty much, until I realized about 6 months later that the person I'd been talking to was named Connie Chung. And she was on her way out to Los Angeles. She had never had any experience at all, but boy, did that young lady, did her star take off.
You're not kidding. You know, I remember a professor at Indiana University who said that radio was a different kind of medium in the fact that when you graduated from school, if you had any sense, you were willing to go to Minot, North Dakota, or Bozeman, Montana, where students who went to business school, for example, tended to go back to their hometown and ply their trade there. But in broadcasting, if, as I say, if you know what's good for you, you'll start somewhere, even if it means relocating across the country after you graduate.
As far as the network side of radio, it died probably, well, it's still in the process of dying. There still are the major networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, and what used to be Mutual, which is now, depends on what day of the week it is, I guess. It could be Westwood, it could be Infinity. It's kind of like musical chairs. But anyway, those guys are still hanging on, and God love them. I hope they continue to. There are still people out there, at least in automobiles, who are listening to the radio, to other things besides Howard Stern and Rush Limbaugh and half a dozen others. But there still is a basic news program being promulgated, and I'm grateful for that, and because it means at least part of my life is still around, at least the part that I fancied enjoying most of all.
You know, I have not watched a television. I have not owned a television for about 6 years now. Mm-hmm. And my news, unless it's breaking news I get on the internet, is by listening to CBS Radio on the hour. Mm-hmm. And luckily, where I live, there is news on the top of the hour every hour. But you know, there are a lot of people who live in cities where there is no network news on radio anymore.
Even major cities. It's just
right, and you used to be able to tune across the dial at the top of the hour, and it was difficult not to find news going on somewhere. Dick, you mentioned the importance of radio when you were first starting out, and thank you for mentioning Fibber McGee and Molly. I discovered that show about 6 years ago, and I just think that it is one of the shining moments in entertainment in America. Can you give us a sense of what it was like right after the war, right before the proliferation of television, as to how important radio was, in many ways bigger than television is now?
Well, I can recall, I remember like it was only yesterday, sitting with my mother and father, and occasionally a visitor, an aunt or an uncle, in the living room, in a semi-darkened room, looking at a wooden box, which was over in the corner. And music and people's voices came out of that box. But that was radio. And you would sit there, and if you were a kid with a vivid imagination, active imagination, you would be weaned on Terry and the Pirates and Hop Harrigan and Captain Midnight, and wonderful adventure shows. And kids of today, I mean, if you took the television set away from them and put them in a room with a little box and say, here, this is going to be your entertainment, they think you were crazy. And they certainly wouldn't stand for it, because everything has to be tactile, it has to be observable. They've forgotten what the imagination is like.
As much as I would like to take a radio show to a junior high school class, maybe one of the really good Lone Rangers or Sergeant Preston, I don't think they could understand it any more than if you were speaking Greek to them.
I'm afraid you're right. It's interesting you would mention that. I happen to be, one of the major things I do in retirement is I'm part of a group that does old-time radio shows, including Fibber McGee and Molly. We got a performance of Our Miss Brooks coming up in the next couple of weeks. And we do radio versions of the old Lux Radio Theater, which gives us a wonderful opportunity to do movies, like Casablanca is one of our staples. And
by the way, hold that thought, but I've talked about this before. You have probably heard the Lux Radio Theater Casablanca, and the neat thing about it, it's not with Bogey and Bergman. They couldn't get them at the last minute. It's with Alan Ladd and Hedy Lamarr. And it's so interesting to hear a movie that you've seen 1,000 times with different actors.
Yeah.
It's a neat experience.
Yeah. It was, I remember the Screen Guild players also did their version of Casablanca.
And they did it in 30 minutes.
Yes, right. And the rewriting, I should say, was very good in those days. Our audiences are obviously they're kind of long in the tooth, you might say. They're our age. People who grew up, as I did, and the people in our group did, in the golden age of radio. And there's a wonderful warmth and the radiation of the smiles from the audience when Fibber McGee's closet opens, right? And he hears those wonderful sound effects of all the stuff falling on the floor. And we do that because we make our own sounds, which is part of the charm of the things that we're doing. At least it lives that way in the memories of older people. But as the years go by, our audiences keep diminishing in size,
yeah.
for obvious reasons.
Aren't we lucky, though? And you're slightly older than I am, but because when I grew up, I really wasn't hooked on radio, and television was just coming on. So my knowledge of old-time radio is by research. But yet I listen to it at night. I turn out the lights, and I'll listen to two of Fibber McGee and Molly. And then there were some great shows in the last days of radio, a show called Frontier Gentlemen that John Daner did. And then they took the television show Have Gun Will Travel and moved it over to radio. Right. But thank God our generation is able to use its imagination. And in many ways, I think when you and I did news, that we were simply extending that theater of the mind because we were, as Orson Welles liked to call himself, storytellers. And I like to think that the stories we were telling on network radio news were a little bit more factual than the stories that are being told today.
Well, you were talking about the shows that made the transfer from radio to television. I have to mention Gunsmoke. And on the radio, there was only one guy who could be Matt Dillon, and that was the guy who played it on radio. Unfortunately, when they started casting for television, that guy was a pudgy, middle-aged fella with a pencil mustache, Bill Conrad. And they said, sorry, Bill, he had a wonderful voice and continued doing great voiceovers and all that, but he missed out on being the television Matt Dillon for obvious reasons. James Arness took the part. And but
there were so many examples of that. I mean, some of the most beautiful sounding female lead actresses in radio were totally unrecognizable when they left the studio. They were just average-looking housewives, but that was the magic of radio. If you sounded right, you were perfect for the part. Dick, let's go back to Buffalo. You're a young guy who, like almost everyone who eventually makes it in broadcasting, was a hangers-on, a groupie, if you will, when you were still very, very young. When did you first get the break and get behind the microphone, and were you doing news or spinning records? My
dream was to be not in news, but in programming. I wanted to be a disc jockey. that was my ambition. In again, a major market like Buffalo. Well, it so happens that in midway through my freshman year in high school, my father got a transfer to the town of Olean, which is south of Buffalo by about 70 miles. They have a lovely, wonderful little radio station there, at least it was, right next to St. Bonaventure University, where I ended up going to college. So in my college sophomore year, I applied for a job with WHTL, Olean, New York, and they hired me as a third-class engineer. And I would just sit there and watch the needles bounce and take the temperature of the transmitter and little odds and ends like that. And finally, one day, this sounds like something out of a Judy Garland movie, station manager called and said, the newscaster won't be in. He's indisposed, which was a euphemism for what ailed so many people in those days in broadcasting. He said, can you do the newscast, which was coming up in 20 minutes? I said, sure, I'd love to. So I grabbed some copy, AP. We had the AP radio wire, and I went in there, and I read a newscast. I was too excited to be nervous, which was my saving grace, I suppose. But anyway, they liked it well enough so that when there was an opening in the department, in the newscasting, well, they were announcers, essentially, small stations. They didn't have departments. So I got a job, and I played records part of the time, and I read newscasts another part of the time, and I was happy as a pig in clover. It was just wonderful, and great training. In those days, we're talking about the years 1953, 54, running there. WHDL Olean was unique, at least in New York State, for having the only station that did not simulcast AM and FM broadcasting. They took a separate feed from WQXR in New York, which is classical music. They tied in with the rural radio network, which was targeted toward farmers. And all my life, when I think back on those experiences, I think of the farmers. I think of the cows in their stalls being milked, listening to Mozart, and it must have been,
well, it was a quality milk.
It must have been quality milk, right? Those are quality radio stations, and so I developed a real appreciation for good classical music, and I got my first exposure into news.
Isn't it interesting that, and again, I don't want to sound like some old guy who thinks everything today's bad, but up until the time when radio became deregulated, when one company could own 3,000 radio stations, and it used to be able to only own 7, wasn't there this feeling that radio was very much an institution in a way? I mean, a lot of radio stations were started by newspapers, and even though it might have been a license to print money, there was still a little bit of a feeling among the owners that you were a pretty darn important part of the community. You weren't just there to make money.
Oh, that's true. And we were also celebrities.
Yes.
I'll tell you, people may deny this, but recognition is just a terrific feeling, and you do not experience that on the network side of radio. Duck Thomas, whom we both knew and loved, was a newscaster for Mutual, and before that for NBC and ABC. He used to say, all we are a bunch of pretty voices.
Instead of pretty faces?
Instead of pretty faces. And I would follow it up sometimes by saying, when people ask me what I do, I say I work for Mutual. It's kind of like the Witness Protection Society or program. You could disappear in Mutual and never be heard from again.
Well, Dick, you talk about recognition. You may know the name Fred Foy. He was the best known and last narrator for the Lone Ranger.
Yes, sir.
Fred and I were pretty good friends, and we were talking one day about the show, and he said the first time he really felt good about being on the Lone Ranger was he was at his grandfather's house, and his grandfather asked him a question about a plot element of the show the day before. And Fred said, well, I guess you're listening because I'm your grandson. He said, no, I like that show. And then he mentions another person his age who listened, and Fred Foy said, you know, when I first realized adults were listening to the Lone Ranger, I got kind of excited.
I was at 36 years working at Mutual. I got maybe 4 or 5 letters in that entire time, and maybe as many telephone calls commenting on something I did, either good or bad. But you know, that's not many people, and you wonder, is anybody out there? So sometimes it was just the feeling was you were talking to the long lines guy at AT&T downtown.
We should explain that before satellites, all of the sound of radio went essentially through the phone company, not on wires that had dial tones, but separate wires. And the guys at the phone company, and back then these installations were manned 24 hours a day, they could stick a cord in and listen to anything you were doing. You're right. I used to picture these guys drinking coffee at 3 in the morning and listening to one of the networks.
You know, you mentioned satellite. Good old Mutual was the first that went into the satellite delivery business for network news. Or for anything. We delivered our entire programming on satellite before anybody else did, which was one of the few firsts, I think, that Mutual can take credit for.
Well, and sadly, before that, Mutual was known for having some pretty cheap network lines. I mean, some of the newscasts sounded as if they were coming through a telephone.
Well, they were.
I'm not going to mention the gentleman's name, but I heard a story that there was a venerable newscaster on Mutual. His initials were M.E., and he had emphysema. And before they went to satellite, you didn't hear him wheeze. But once they went to satellite, you would hear, I'll use his name, he was a lovely man, Martin Edwards, Mutual News, and then you'd hear, and they started getting phone calls, and they said, is Mr. Edwards all right? But he always had that little breathy wheeze in his voice, which was not apparent until you had these high-fidelity satellite circuits.
Well, most of our stations were at the end of a Class D line, which is just one small step above telephone line, telephone quality. So, it was quite a run.
Let's talk about Mutual. People today have never heard of it. I feel badly about that. I feel bad that, for example, my dad worked for Montgomery Ward for 38 years, and you have to explain to kids today what Montgomery Ward's was. I said, look at Sears. This was even bigger than that. Mutual was a network that had some interesting shows. Well, as a matter of fact, it carried the Lone Ranger and the Shadow and some wonderful detective shows. But it also, in spite of the fact that it might not have had the name recognition of CBS, had a phenomenal news department. I always thought that the sound of Mutual News, and hearing you on the air, for example, was a sound I knew I could trust. Take us back to when you first joined Mutual and what that news gathering operation was like. In other words, give us a flavor of what it was like to sit there and have all of this stuff funneling through you.
Oh, Dennis, let's see, where do we start?
Go ahead, Dick. You got the rest of the hour.
Mutual hired me in Berlin. I'd been sent to Berlin by the American Forces Network, and AFN wanted to send me back to Frankfurt. They needed a weekend editor, and I pleaded with them. I said, I love Berlin. I know Berlin. I covered the wall, and I just want to stay here. He said, I'm sorry, we're going to have to insist, but we do need you back here in Frankfurt. So I packed up my stuff, packed up my wife and then only daughter, and we went down to Frankfurt. But before that, I'd actually applied for a job with the commercial network, several as a matter of fact, and did a tape for Mutual. The Mutual correspondent in Berlin was going to leave to go to London, so Mutual needed somebody to replace him. I cut a tape, sent it off to New York, and they sat on it. You know,
this would have been about what year?
That was 1961, right after the wall went up. I'm sitting at the Frankfurt AFN news desk on I think it was a Saturday or Friday evening, and the phone rings, and it was my contact back in Berlin who had finally heard back from Mutual in New York, and they said, hey, they liked your tape. They want you to start. When can you begin if you still want the job? Now, picture this. My wife, daughter, and I had moved. Our furniture was still somewhere in East Germany, traveling between Berlin and back to Frankfurt. So I said, well, I think I could give them 2 weeks and see whether they can accept that. And I went in and talked to the head of the network, and I said, I know I just came here. It may sound silly, but I had an offer of a good job back in Berlin, so I had to put in my resignation. And they were very surprised that I would do that. It seemed like a silly thing to do. That night, I went down to the AFN bar in our building, which was incidentally a 13th century castle. It had enormous charm. And they had a bar back it was formerly a dungeon, I suppose. Sitting there having a drink, and there's a sergeant sitting next to me. He said, Dick, I understand you're actually going to leave. And I said, yeah. I said, I got an offer with one of the major networks. And he said, which one? And I said, Mutual. And he thought for a minute. He said, oh, my God, they just filed for bankruptcy. And I put down my drink, and I said...
For the first of many times.
You mean putting down the drink or the bankruptcy? Anyway, I was sorely tempted to go back upstairs and withdraw my resignation. I don't know, I had too much pride. And also I did some checking and found out that the sergeant was only half right. They were about to go into bankruptcy, and 3M came along and bought the place and paid off all the debts, and we were actually on solid ground. I mean, the 3M company is wonderful, and they were very benevolent toward us. So it worked out okay. My wife and daughter and I shipped ourselves out of Frankfurt, went back to Berlin. And then after about a couple of years of working for Mutual, and the story had pretty much dried up because the wall was up, the refugee flow had stopped, and the world's attention was toward the Middle East and toward Southeast Asia. Vietnam was just beginning to come to light.
What was the city of Berlin like during those days when the wall was going up? And eventually, of course, President Kennedy would come there. But, Berlin, I've never been there, but I have always thought that it had to be one of the most dynamic cities in the world, off and on. But to see that city cut in half and sectored after the war was bad enough. What was it like living there?
It was a wonderful experience. The Berliners are wonderful people. There's a difference that all Americans, I'm sure, who have been to Berlin, and in other parts of Germany, they share the same observation. That is, the Berlin people loved Americans, and for a very good reason, because we performed an absolutely incredible feat in 1948 and 1949 by supplying the entire city of Berlin with the food and coal that it needed to go through probably the worst winter in history. It was the blockade, the Berlin blockade, where Stalin in those days shut down West Berlin as a very, very brutal and very unsubtle attempt to force the Americans and the British and the French to depart Berlin.
And we should point out that Berlin did not have access to what we would call the free world. It was an island.
It was an island
in the middle of occupied territory.
Yeah, 200 miles was the closest point to West Germany from West Berlin. If you look at a map from those days, it was a sea of red. Berlin was surrounded by East Germany, which was communist. And the only way you could get in and out was a very tightly controlled autobahn, which led from the city of Helmstedt in West Germany to Berlin, and that was monitored by the Soviet and East Germans, so nobody would dare venture a side trip, for instance. You could do that, or you could fly in. They left the air corridors open, and that was the reason why we were able to run the airlift without starving off the entire city of Berlin.
Now, those DC-3s, the old Goonie bird, the C-47s that were flying in there, and you can't imagine flying coal in an airplane, but you're saying that everything that Berlin had to have to exist, and this was about how many people, how many million?
On the west side, something like 2.5 million.
Yeah, all of that was coming in by air. There must have been a plane coming in every 30 seconds.
Actually, every 90 seconds. It was mainly coal. And it was enough coal to keep the population alive. As I said...
Weren't there some great stories about right before landing, the pilots throwing out chocolate bars to the kids on the ground?
Yeah, there was one pilot especially got a well-deserved reputation for being the candy bomber. Made little parachutes, and he would drop them on runs over Berlin, very low altitude, and of course the kids would run out and pick up the candy, and he was very celebrated and was honored by the Berlin population. There are all kinds of wonderful stories like that.
Dick, how long did the blockade last before the Soviets finally relented?
It was actually only about a year.
That's still a long time to bring in everything by air.
Yes, that's what we're talking about. As I say, the coldest winter that the city had ever experienced. The thing was an engineering marvel. The Air Force, the people who concocted the plan and saw it through. Even Truman was rather skeptical that the thing would work, and so and George Marshall, who was Secretary of State at the time. But they gave it a try, and sure enough, they pulled it off. And Stalin, was absolutely humiliated. He realized he had lost, and he opened without any word of explanation, of course. But they removed the barriers and opened all the roads and the canals, and it was like nothing had ever happened.
Dick, before going on the air, you said you wanted to talk about an incident in which you were called in and really put on the spot on a German TV show right as things were beginning to happen there. And you also made a prediction that you would come to regret later. Tell us about that.
I'd been invited to appear on a German news television show from Berlin, kind of like Meet the Press. A bunch of news guys sat around and talked like they knew what they were speaking about. And it was shortly after the murder of an East German refugee who attempted to get over the wall, and he was shot down and permitted to bleed to death. He was like 3 feet away from the West Berlin side of the border. there was no wall at that point. All the GIs on the west side would have had to do is reach over and pull them to safety and for hospital treatment. But the GIs who were standing there were under orders not to venture into the eastern side of the city for absolutely any reason at all. That could be considered provocative, and it could start World War III. Of course, that's what everybody was always concerned about. So everybody was just standing around watching this poor guy. His name was Peter Fechter, die. He just bled to death. And for the first time in history, the Berliners were really ticked at the Americans for not going over and helping out. That sets the stage for my appearance on this German television show. It was the week that Peter Fechter was permitted to die. So the producer of the program called me at home in Berlin and said, well, he wanted me to be on the show. And I said, well, things are pretty dicey diplomatically now, and we got this Peter Fechter thing. He said, don't worry, we're not going to ask you anything that could be, embarrassing to you or difficult. I said, okay, fine. So I show up, 11 o'clock Sunday morning, sitting there. First question, Herr Rosee, why did not the Americans help this poor East German refugee who was bleeding to death? I said, why, you son of a gun.
They pulled a bait and switch on you.
Did. So I'm stumbling my way through, trying to explain the unexplainable. At least it was senseless to me. Morally, it was a criminal thing to let the man die. Politically, yeah, okay, maybe it would have been kind of risky, but I don't think that would have provoked World War III. So I say, mumble my way through, and finally he senses my embarrassment, and he turns to the rest of the panel. The show continues, and they leave me alone until the very last question. He said, Herr Rosee, kommt President Kennedy nach Berlin? Will President Kennedy come to Berlin? That was a question I could answer. I was convinced. I said, no, he will not come to Berlin. And the host said, why? I said, well, he had sent Vice President Johnson, and he had certainly given all kinds of demonstrations, put in another battle group. They were not going to bow to Soviet blandishments. So I couldn't see any good reason for him to come to Berlin. And the show ended. The following morning, the Berlin Morgenpost, which was the most famous paper in Berlin at the time, on the front page has a story. American correspondent says, President Kennedy will not be coming to Berlin. My colleagues at lunch that day said, where'd you get that information from? I said, well, I just figured it out. It just doesn't... a gut feeling that he was not going to come. The rest, as they say, is history. He came, and he said, Ich bin ein Berliner, and it was one of the most exciting moments in Berlin's history. There were 1 million people stood out there in front of the city hall and cheered him.
Dick Rosse, I have heard, and it may be a joke, that Kennedy's accent was such that Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner, sounded something like I am a jelly donut. Is that true?
As a matter of fact, it sounded very much like a jelly donut. It wasn't the word itself. A Berliner is a jelly donut. But if you put my wife is German. I've asked her this because the question usually comes up at least once or twice during an anniversary of his saying that. He said, Ich bin ein Berliner. He should have said, Ich bin Berliner. In other words, he should have not put the article in there. But nobody would think that he was talking about jelly donuts. I mean, Berliner could be a jelly donut. It could also be a citizen of Berlin. But if you put an article in front of it, which he should have done properly, that would have specifically eliminated the jelly donut from being part.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. That appearance he made, speaking to those people in Berlin, I think was one of the high points in U.S. history. It was a magic moment.
It was a magic moment. It really didn't affect the balance of power between East and West. It didn't make the East and West any closer together or make them any farther apart. The Berlin Wall itself, the construction of it, was not a real defining moment in East-West politics because the wall was put up as a strictly defensive basis by the East Germans. They had to stop their population from coming over to the West, which they were doing. They were hemorrhaging people, talented people. So they had to do something drastic. And the drastic thing they did was they put up this wall. But it was on their side of the border. They continued to permit the West access to the East Berlin. This is part of this post-war agreement signed in Potsdam and Yalta. So they were very careful to obey the letter of the law. They did not do anything illegal. If we had sent our tanks in there to tear the wall down, they would have been operating entirely in the East German Communist territory. You could make an argument for saying that that would have been an illegal action, and they had every right to stop us from doing that. In any event, the real scary thing in Berlin happened in October of 1961, when the East German Guards zealously decided they were not going to let the top American State Department guy in West Berlin, they were not going to let him travel into East Berlin, even though he had credentials. He was in an official car, so he was forced to turn around, and he went back to someplace where he could use a telephone, and he called General Clay. Lucius Clay was President Kennedy's representative in Berlin at the time. He said, hey, they just stopped me from going into East Berlin. Clay didn't bat an eye. He called the tanks out. American tanks rolled down to the border, and they lined up, and they had their muzzles within about 50 yards of the Soviets on the other side of the line. The Soviets then pulled their tanks up and aimed them at our tanks. And for about 2 or 3 days, we had locked and loaded Patton tanks on our side and T-54s or T-34s on the Soviet side. I went up to a GI who was leaning out of the turret of his tank, and I said, hey, you really don't have a round in that cannon, do you? He said, I sure do. All I got to do is pull this. He pointed to the lanyard that he had there, and poof, that's all there is. And my stomach just took a real sour turn because, that's the way it's going to end. Not with a whimper or a bang, but a cannon shot probably out of a tank. So that could have been deadly.
Dick, how long were you in Berlin before you came back to the States for good?
Well, I actually spent 7 years in Germany, close to 4 years in Berlin of that 7 years. Came back in 1963, about 2 months before JFK was assassinated.
Now, were you in Washington or New York when that happened? New York.
In fact, a newscaster and I were both in the wire room before the 1:30 newscast, and it was about 1:27, and 5 bell alarm sounded from the AP, which means flash, and it was the word that Kennedy had been shot. They didn't have the death at that moment, but and it was a Friday afternoon. I was bureau chief. I didn't have any staff because the only person there was Dick DeFreitas, who was doing the next newscast. Everybody was out taking an early happy hour, so we sent somebody down there to Cheers to get everybody back to the office. And we went on full mobilization, full alert, and stayed that way until after the burial on Sunday.
You know, for the generation today that was not alive, they find it difficult to believe when I sometimes lecture that I tell kids, I remember what I was wearing that afternoon. I mean, it was a rainy, horrible Friday in Indiana. I was in Catholic high school, and of course, Kennedy having been the first and only Catholic president, there was this great affinity, and it was one of the darkest days of my life, specifically when I saw the nuns start to cry. I never will forget that feeling.
It was a horrendous weekend. I must say, though, I've got a few years on you, Dennis, and I remember even more vividly what I was doing when we got the word that FDR had died. That was in 1945, just before the end of World War II. I was a Cub Scout, and the den mother called down, the president has died. And wow, we cried, of course. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt had been the only president any of us had ever known. This was his 4th term. He began being president in 1933, so he'd been around for a long time, and he was much loved.
I saw a wonderful documentary about FDR, and I think the one thing I remember most was a guy raised in the lap of luxury who, in his first inaugural address and subsequent chats on radio, spoke to the American people with the words, "My friends." No one had ever done that before.
He was considered to be a traitor to his class by all the rich people, of course. And he did have an aristocratic demeanor, and he spoke like an aristocrat. So he did everything he could to make his appeal as broad-based as possible. Yes, they were his friends, and those friends elected him 4 times, which would never happen again because of a constitutional amendment.
And there were an awful lot of families in America that kept a photo of FDR on the wall above the radio.
Oh yeah, well he was like a saint. I mean,
yeah. He was the Messiah at the time. You know, we could do a whole hour on this, but it makes me wonder that had it not been for FDR, who was night and day different from the very laid-back Hoover, and the Depression had not ended, we might be 3 or 4 separate countries right now. I mean, the nation was falling apart.
Well, you could say the same thing about Abraham Lincoln. Had he not been president, had he not pursued the Civil War, there definitely would have been at least 2 countries resulting from that. Neither half much good.
So, Dick, you're in New York, and you get there right before President Kennedy was assassinated. How long were you in New York before you came to Washington? Because I think, in my mind, the reports most people remember you having done were the ones from Berlin and the ones from D.C.
Yeah, well, 12 years in total in New York, and the remainder of my time was Washington. What happened was the network in its wisdom decided they were going to consolidate, which is a euphemism, I guess, for cutting back. They closed it. Downsizing, right. But they certainly downsized New York. They just closed it down. And I was lucky enough to be invited down to Washington. They wanted me to go into management, but I was having too much fun as a reporter and newscaster. So I stayed with the... also I was able to keep my AFTRA membership intact, and that became extremely valuable when I retired. So that's how it ended up.
Dick, you had mentioned the name of Duff Thomas earlier. I must tell the audience that I first heard Duff Thomas when he was at ABC, and I wanted so much to get into broadcasting. I took the step in high school of actually calling some of the newscasters to get to know them. And I became fairly good acquaintances with Edward P. Morgan, who was an ABC commentator who had me sit in with him 3 days when I was 17, and it was like dying and going to heaven, you know. But I remember I went to work for Mutual, and I'm in the newsroom, and I'm hearing this guy talk. I thought, my God, that's Duff Thomas. And I went over and introduced myself to him, and he said, "Why didn't you go across the room and call me?" But he called me Denny Dangerfield because I was always knocking stuff over. Sweet man, though. I think there are nice people all over, but the camaraderie of a newsroom, where you have all of those people with very similar educational backgrounds who are walking encyclopedias, working in an atmosphere together, is pretty darn exhilarating sometimes.
Most of the time. And very little backbiting. I think one of the reasons why Mutual was a especially nice place to be at was we all felt like we really we had to be on our toes all the time because we were outgunned by the competition. By outgunning, I mean they had the material, they had more people than we had, better facilities, more bureaus, and so we had a lot to catch up on, and we did. I think we held our own pretty well.
And there's something Mutual had to do, that we at UPI Radio, who looked at you guys as being the big time, we thought we were the shoestring operation. We relied on what were called stringers. And these are the guys and gals out at the local radio station in cities where you don't have a bureau, who were right there calling in something when it happened. For 2 reasons. They wanted to be on the network, and they wanted their stringer payment.
I remember when UPI moved to their new place in it was new at the time, around 14th Street in Washington. Lovely building. Their own building. That's more than we ever had. I also remember Gene Gibbons, who was working at UPI for many years, was a White House correspondent for a time on the radio side. He told me about the time that when things were really getting rough, and I'm not sure you were there when Helen Thomas was still the beat reporter.
Yes, I was. I was with UPI Radio 20 years. I was there from 77, and I was in D.C. from 77 through 97, and I was with UPI from 83 through 2003.
Well, through good times and bad times. But Jean tells us the story how one day she was ordered to fly down to maybe Plains, whoever was president and wherever he had his vacation home. And they didn't have the money to pay for her flight. She had to pay out of her own pocket, and she broke down and cried. And I said, well, things have been bad at Mutual, but I don't think we've ever gotten so awfully bad that we had to have our people pay for their own airline tickets.
You know, when UPI went through its first bankruptcy, on the Sunday show that David Brinkley did, until he became too ill and someone else took it over on the weekends on NBC, he mentioned the fact that almost everybody in broadcasting had worked for United Press International at one time. And he was the bureau chief in Kentucky during the election. It must have been 46 or 48, and he called up and said, I can't do the entire state of Kentucky by myself. What am I supposed to do? They said, look at the Associated Press figures and change them by 5%. And then he said, if I took a taxi, they asked me why I didn't take a bus. If I took a bus, they asked me why I didn't walk. And then in that inimitable Brinkley style, he said, how can a company that's never had any money suddenly go bankrupt? And we had a tape of that, and when things would get slow, we'd play it in the newsroom. I wish I still had it. Dick, a couple of quick final questions here. Is there a certain day or week or month in your career that if you could wave a magic wand and go back to that time, you would be there in a heartbeat?
I don't have to think hard about it either.
When was that?
November, the night that the wall came down. And Mutual remembered that I'd been there when it went up. They said, why don't you come back and report on its demise? And I said, you bet. I boarded a Pan Am plane from Dulles that very evening and got over to Berlin in time for the biggest, most wonderful demonstration I've ever experienced in my life. They let down all the barriers and permitted all the East Berliners to come to West Berlin. People had not seen West Berlin, most of them never saw it because it had been up for 28 years. The wall had, but they were ecstatic, and they looked in the shop windows, and it was like Christmas morning, and everybody it was New Year's, and it was it was the World Series, and everything that was good and happy, and it was the happiest day of my life too, because it was so contagious, the feeling of optimism and hope. It was short-lived, of course, because we had other matters to attend to, like Iraq, a year or so later. But for a short while, there was that wonderful feeling of euphoria that the Cold War was ended, things were going to work out okay.
Wow. There have been only a few other moments like that. I think the photo of them breaking down the wall is very close to that classic photo where the sailor is kissing the girl. It was either on VJ or VE Day in New York, probably VE Day. That is burned in our mind. How many times did you get kissed over there in Berlin?
I'm going to Fifth Amendment on that one.
I think you can safely say in what you're trying to tell us that it was an indescribable euphoria.
Yes, in all seriousness. I was never embraced. Nobody even shook my hand. They were too busy. I was too busy working, and everybody else was too busy having a good time. If we're talking about the same event, when the wall came down. There was delirium that night. It was a night to remember and never forget.
Dick Rosssee, this has been a fun hour. We could probably spend half a day talking. I think when two radio people get together, you need to have an awful lot of recording tape ready. You've had some marvelous experiences. You brought a lot of us a great deal of joy with the style of your reporting, and it tickles me that you're doing recreated old-time radio now. I think that's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. You got to come back. Next time you're this way, stop by, and we'll treat you to a performance of, Fibber McGee and Molly would be good, I guess, for students.
I love it. Right. Dick, thanks a lot.
You're welcome, Dennis. Thank you for having me.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.